Hello and welcome to History Through Fiction, the podcast. I'm your host, Colin Mustful, and today I'm happy to be joined by Marie Gage, author of A Touch of Promise. Marie, welcome.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Well, let's start with Pearl Griffith. Who is she, and when is this novel? Where and when does this novel take place?
Okay, so this novel takes place beginning in 1947. Pearl is one of the over 40,000 war brides who came to Canada after World War II. And she married before she came from the United Kingdom to Canada, but has moved into circumstances that are somewhat difficult. I don't know whether you know this or not, but the war brides who returned after World War II with their husbands were not accepted by women in North America. I think the same was true in the United States as in Canada. They felt that they had stolen men from the women of North America, and they weren't happy with them. So there were lots of issues that they encountered as they attempted to acclimate to their new country.
Yeah, tell me more about these war brides. It's a history I'm unfamiliar with. Tell me about the research you did into their experience and how you're able to share it on the page here in this novel.
Well, there's really two ways that I'm able to share it. One is that my mother-in-law was one of those 40,000 plus women who came over. And so she told me a lot of stories. Now, this story is not her story per se, but there are pieces of it that are both informed and inspired by the stories that she told me. Um, in addition, I have read a number of nonfiction books that were written about war brides, and there are a number of websites with stories of war brides posted. And I believe that there was a larger number of war brides that moved to Canada than to the United States. And the reason was that, I mean, Canada joined the war effort earlier than the United States did. And there was a pause when the men were sent over to the United Kingdom. The invasion into France got delayed by more than a year. So there were men that were living in the United Kingdom and doing things that were social in nature that brought them into contact with the women of the United Kingdom. And so, as always happens, romance happened and marriages happened and children were born, and that changed the future for those men, and brought a lot of new women into our country.
Can you talk a little bit more about Pearl's experience and how she was able to create her identity, her new identity in Canada?
At first, Pearl floundered because she had moved into a home where her mother-in-law had been invited to live with them. And she had done that happily because her experience at her home was that family was foremost and that you had good relations with the family that were closest to you. But she came here to find that her mother-in-law was not welcoming of her. So in her own home, she had struggles. So she had to look for ways to cope, and in the end, found a group of other women of similar backgrounds that became a group to support one another. And they there were a couple of the women in the group who had husbands who were suffering from what we today would call post-traumatic stress. And so Pearl ended up helping those women to look after their families and look after their husbands in a place called the Psychiatric Institute in London, Ontario. So the group kind of formed out of the necessity of everyone needing to adjust, and became a peer support kind of group.
Can you talk a little bit more about that, about sisterhood and female friendship, and how strong of a theme that is in this novel?
It's a very strong theme in this novel. The women sort of come. Pearl ends up being a bit of the anchor of the group, the inspiration of the formation of the group. She finds one woman who is really struggling because of her husband being somewhat abusive due to his psychological damage from the war, and helps her through it. And in the process of that, meets a number of other women who are struggling in a similar way. So she puts her mind and her heart into helping those women, and in turn, they help her to resolve the issues that she's having in her home with her mother-in-law. So it's a very mutually binding kind of group that's formed, that the women are supporters. And I think, it's a theme that we women see happening over and over again in similar circumstances.
Can you talk about how you express the history of everyday people, and even in the context of this history itself, it's post World War II, the recovering after those major battles and major events that people might have heard of. This is something that people are less, will know less about, and it's about everyday individuals. Why do you choose to share that lesser known history rather than the big headlines in history?
I I think, well, my personal belief is that every person has a story that's worth telling and a story that's worth learning from. And I started on this journey because I um, started to do some family research. And it was really with my first novel, A Ring of Promises, where I was following my grandparents, who you can see on the wall here, through their immigration history into Canada. And I started to realize how much the ordinary people in our world impact the future of our society and the future of us personally, and how little we know and how little we were told. It used to be in that day and age that you didn't tell stories, you didn't brag about things that you'd done. I mean, I never really knew what my grandfather meant when he said he missed the Titanic. And I'll never know because that piece has been lost because it wasn't documented. And I had no idea until I found a journal that he'd written that he had worked building the um, Hudson Bay Railway on the shores of Hudson Bay. I had no idea he'd ever been there because our people of that era did not tell stories. And I think a lot of the richness of my own family history was lost. But it touches on a richness of history in our country. Every person sort of intersects with that history. So I feel it's important to tell those stories, and it's important to learn from those stories, and it's important to understand how brave our ancestors were to do the things that they did. I mean, my grandfather picked up stakes. He had been a footman in the United Kingdom, and he came to be a logger in Canada. And that's a huge transition. And he just took almost what was on his back and $25 and got on a boat. So I think we don't necessarily appreciate those people enough. And I think that telling the stories of ordinary people in extraordinary times helps to understand that. And I think every family needs to look at their own history. And I hope that reading my novels will inspire people to look at their history. And mine are, just to be clear, they're fictionalized, but they have a strong basis in the fact of things that I know happened to people in my family.
Can you talk more about that from a craft standpoint? Because I think a lot of people like you, they take an interest in their family history and they're kind of amazed at what their parents and grandparents and great grandparents did and accomplished. But it's quite one thing to take an interest in it and quite another to put it on the page and make it a compelling story. How are you able to accomplish that?
Well, when I started, I wasn't really sure what I was doing, to tell you the truth. I learned as I went. I took courses along the way. I talked with other people who had crafted stories. I worked with good editors and just people that could encourage me to move ahead. In reality, when I started writing my grandparents' story, I intended to write a short story. And I got so caught up in it that it became way too long for a short story and became a novel. So it was just piece by piece that it happened, and that I got the grounding that I needed in order to write. I'd always I'd written things that had been published before, but they were nonfiction and they were scientifically based articles. So I had to make a transition from that sort of very factual writing into, the writing of a novel and a very different sort of storytelling process. And it was a long time. It took me 10 years with the first novel before it was there.
What's been the most rewarding aspect of sticking with it and getting to this point?
Um, I think having other people read and enjoy the stories and tell me how much it meant to them. And I think the biggest thing is when I hear that somebody else is starting to capture their own family history. And I know that not everybody will write a novel, but I hope that everybody will, have their eldest members of their family tell them stories, and that they'll document them in some way, whether they write them down or they do a recording like we're doing now, or just something so that the trail is still there, and that no, their descendants in the future aren't disappointed when they can't find the facts the way that I was disappointed.
I'm always a little curious about authors' path to publication. Can you talk a little more, not just about the rewards, but about some of the challenges and what has surprised you and what have you learned along the way in order to not just help you craft the fiction narratives, but get them out into the world, into readers' hands?
Well, I mean, I know without a doubt that I couldn't do it without my editors. I work with two different editors at two different times in the process, and I never would have gotten there without their encouragement and their savvy with respect to how to modify anything that I'd done so that it was more palatable for the reader. So I've really benefited from the nurturing of the relationship with those two individuals.
Now, A Touch of Promise is, I believe, a third book in your Promise series, which you say are standalone novels, and yet it is a series. Can you talk about both the standalone nature and the thread that ties this series together?
Well, the thread that ties the series together is that they're stories of ordinary people in extraordinary times. So they're about things that have touched our history, and I mean they're also all sort of early to mid 1900s stories, which ties them. They're also tied together on the theme of promise, that in each one, they had something that they were striving for, that promised to change their life, change the world. And they personally benefited as well as the world benefited from the things that were happening in those times. And so each individual novel tells a complete story, and the characters are, for the most part, different, although Pearl and Rod appear in two of them because Promise of the Bluebell Woods is the story of Pearl and Rod during the war and follows the number 10 Canadian General Hospital through the war, as well as follows Pearl as a 18-year-old woman helping to entertain the troops while they were waiting for the invasion to happen in England. So it's a complete story, and much as A Touch of Promise has Pearl as a main character in it. It is a continuation of her life once it's in Canada, but it's a completely separate sort of novel. It's not sort of picking up the war theme and continuing with it. It's starting. It's all about her life in Canada. So they're separate and distinct, but they have things that tie them together.
So I'm talking to you in the U.S. A lot of our listeners are U.S. based. What will, we grew up in the U.S. learning United States history as it relates to World War II. What will U.S. readers maybe be surprised by in this Canadian history?
Oh, that's a good question. I think they'll they'll understand the progress of the war from a both a Canadian and a British perspective. That what was happening in Britain in the years before the U.S. entered the war, and how long some of the soldiers, like some of our soldiers, departed in 1939 and weren't back until 1946. So it's a much longer sort of period of time that they were away, and they were part of the fight sort of from that beginning perspective. So the story goes from the time the men joined the number 10 Canadian General Hospital and follows it as they treat people in England while they're waiting for the invasion to happen, and then follows, takes them across on the day of the invasion into France, and follows them as the war progresses within France and Belgium. So the reader will learn things about sort of each of those individual times. And by the time the invasion happened, it's probably not all that different from the American history, because the Americans were there at the same time. So the same things would have been happening. And the hospital that my father-in-law was a part of, and that the character Rod in the book is a part of, was part of a bigger contingent of hospitals right after they landed on the shores in a village that I'm not remembering the name of just off the top of my head right now. It might come to me, but it's not coming to me at the moment. So many of the threads will be the same from the time of the invasion on, but the things leading up to the invasion and the time that was spent on United Kingdom soil and in Scotland will be different.
So when readers put down this novel, A Touch of Promise, what conversations do you hope it sparks about resilience, about the cultural immersion, about PTSD? What in particular do you want readers to come away with talking about?
Well, I want them to, the PTSD thing has a different sort of place in my heart. I was an occupational therapist that worked at a hospital in London, Ontario, that actually managed the Psychiatric Institute in the 80s. And some of the patients that were in the Psychiatric Institute at the time that I was working there in the 80s were still there, or had been there since 1946, or even earlier than that in some cases through the war. So I was touched by the depth of disability that the war had caused for these men, and how much it had changed their lives. And much as I didn't know much about the life of the women who were a part of those men's lives, I was able to sort of bring to life how hard it must have been for the women who were married to those individuals who came back so different from how they were before. So I hope people will take away an understanding that, trauma from the war is and was particularly in World War II when they didn't fully understand what PTSD was. It was something that had a long-ranging, long-lasting effect and really changed the lives of people even after the war was over. So the effects of the war went on forever. But I will also want people to take away that sense of belonging, being a part of what we as human beings need in life, and how a lot of our day is spent, a lot of our lives are spent trying to find that place where we belong. And these women were no different. They were just displaced further from what was normal for them. They were far away from home and sort of set adrift a little bit. And so I hope they come away with some sense of warmth of how people can achieve a different life in a new place, and how they can make a difference in that new world.
Well, those are very valuable messages, and congratulations on, exploring them and bringing that out in your novel. Do you have a fourth book in the series coming?
It's not in the series. It will be a standalone novel. It's on the theme of adoption, and it was inspired actually by my mother's story. My mother, we did not know my mother was adopted until after she died, and um, some of the things that she struggled in her life with a lot of mental health issues. And so I'm writing a novel that gives her a better ending than the one that she had. So it's a theme of adoption, but it also has a bit of an indigenous theme because of a relationship, once again, that the main character in the novel comes into contact with.
Well, that sounds like another wonderful and important topic. Congratulations, Marie, on the books you're now churning out, and how, I know it's a long road to kind of learn that craft and to start really engaging with readers with these important stories. So, congratulations on A Touch of Promise, and thanks so much for joining me on the podcast to talk about it.
And thanks so much for having me.